They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But for Lena, revenge was the fire that fueled her, the silent promise made on her father's grave that became her only reason to exist. She was a ghost with a beautiful face, a woman who could craft the perfect lie but couldn't silence the deafening truth of her loss. With her past destroyed and her future unwritten, she escapes into the one place that holds the key to her vengeance, a glittering gala, a world of shadows and power that is not her own. It's an act of war disguised as an entrance, a single night to find the weakness of a king. But in the crowd, a gaze finds her, and it belongs to a man who owns the city from his throne of glass and steel. He is Frank Costello, a name whispered in fear, a man carved from control and silence, an architect of empires, a predator who sees the flaw in everything and everyone. He doesn't approach her with a threat. He approaches her with a challenge, with a gaze that sees the fire behind her eyes, and with a stillness that commands the entire room. Their connection is no chance encounter. It's a test. She wasn't looking for an ally. She was looking for a target. Instead, she found a mirror. This is the story of a woman who made vengeance her entire world, until she met the one man whose past was a perfect, tragic reflection of her own. It is a tale of how the line between hunter and hunted can blur, and how a man who trusts no one can become obsessed with the one woman who entered his life with a lie. So, hold your breath, and let the first secret pull you into our story. Comment with a black pawn, chess pawn emoji, if you believe the most dangerous games are the ones played with the heart, and subscribe for more tales of dangerous men and the women who dare to challenge them. Get ready for a story about a woman on a mission of revenge, and the Mafia boss who conquered her heart. The dress was a weapon. Red, the color of blood and vengeance. Lena smoothed the silk fabric that clung to her curves, the material cool against her feverish skin. In the full-length mirror of her modest apartment, she didn't see herself. She saw a character, a facade meticulously constructed for a single night, for a single purpose. Her dark hair was swept into an elegant, low chignon, exposing the vulnerable line of her neck, a deliberate contradiction to the armor she wore. Her hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as she picked up the small black velvet clutch. Inside, only the essentials: an invitation, a tube of lipstick, and the mental photograph of the man she had come to destroy. Frank Costello. The name echoed in her mind like a funeral bell. She took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs but not calming the storm that raged in her chest. Show, don't tell, she reminded herself, the maxim of her old acting coach. Don't show nervousness, show confidence. Don't show fear, show power. Tonight, she was not Lena, the girl whose world had been burned to ash. She was an apparition, a mystery wrapped in red silk, ready to walk into the lion's den. The ballroom of the Metropolitan Grand Hotel was an assault on the senses. The glitter of 1,000 crystals from the giant chandeliers fractured in the air, dancing across bare shoulders and expensive jewels. The murmur of powerful conversations was a symphony of secrets and deals, punctuated by the clinking of champagne flutes. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of orchids and the obscene wealth that circulated there. Lena smelled power, an intoxicating mix of old money and new ambition, and beneath it all, a subtle hint of danger, like ozone before a storm. She moved through the crowd with a studied grace, her spine straight, her chin high. Every step was deliberate. Every smile she offered a passing face was a mask. Her eyes, however, did not smile. They scanned, searched, hunted. She plucked a champagne flute from a passing tray, the cold of the crystal a grounding point in the vortex of her emotions. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic beat that felt far too loud in the controlled din of the room. He's here, she thought. I can feel it. And then, the murmur of the room changed. It wasn't a drastic shift, but a subtle displacement of energy, as if the atmospheric pressure had suddenly dropped. Conversations faltered. Smiles became more rigid. People straightened, their gazes turning discreetly toward the grand, arched entrance. Lena followed the invisible current and saw him. Frank Costello did not enter the room, he consumed it. He wasn't the tallest man, nor the most ostentatiously dressed. He wore a flawless black suit, tailored with a precision that spoke more of power than any jewel. It was the stillness around him that defined him. He moved with an economy of motion, a lethal certainty that made everyone else seem clumsy and loud. His hair was dark, shot with silver at the temples, and his face looked as if it were carved from stone, with a strong jaw and a mouth that didn't seem accustomed to smiling. But it was his eyes that caught Lena's breath. They were a startlingly clear, icy blue, and they seemed to absorb all the light in the room, reflecting nothing back. They were the eyes of an apex predator, eyes that saw everything, analyzed everything, and revealed nothing. He paused, one of his men murmuring something in his ear. Frank didn't turn, merely gave an almost imperceptible nod. His gaze swept the room, a slow, possessive scan. Lena felt his eyes pass over her, a physical touch, a shiver that traced its way down her spine. For an instant, she felt a primal panic, the instinct of prey that has just been spotted. She forced her fingers to loosen their grip on the glass. Stay calm. You are the hunter, not the hunted. The plan was simple, in theory. Get noticed, intrigue him. Use her beauty and mystery as bait to get close enough to find a weakness, a crack in his fortress. The execution, she was discovering, was something else entirely. To be in the same room with him, to breathe the same air, was like standing near a force field. The intensity he projected was overwhelming. She moved away from the center of the room, positioning herself near a large window overlooking the glittering city night. She feigned an interest in the lights, presenting her back to him, a calculated move designed to pique curiosity. In a room where everyone vied for his attention, indifference was a provocation. She felt his approach before she heard it. It was a change in the air behind her, a shadow that blocked the light from the ballroom. His scent reached her first, not a heavy cologne, but something subtler and infinitely more masculine. A mix of expensive wool, a hint of whiskey, and something else, something clean and cool like the night air. You seem lost in thought, a voice said beside her. The voice was exactly as she had imagined. Deep, calm, with a timbre that vibrated in the air and seemed to settle directly into her bones. Lena turned slowly, schooling her features into an expression of mild surprise. Just admiring the view, she replied, her own voice a little breathier than she would have liked. It's easy to get lost in it. His blue eyes assessed her. It wasn't the appreciative glance of a man looking at a beautiful woman. It was deeper, more analytical. It was as if he were trying to read the pages of a book written in a language he didn't know, but was determined to decipher. There are far more interesting views in here, he said, and the corner of his mouth lifted in something that was almost a smile, but didn't reach his eyes. The minimal gesture unnerved her. It depends on what you're looking for, she countered, finding a courage she didn't know she possessed. She raised the flute to her lips, a motion to hide the tremor that threatened to betray her. The champagne went down like sandpaper on her dry throat. He took a step, closing the space between them. She could now see the fine lines around his eyes, testament to sleepless nights and hard decisions. He was more imposing up close, a physical presence that demanded to be acknowledged. I'm Frank Costello. He didn't extend a hand. He simply stated his name as a fact, like one might state ownership of a territory. Lena, she said, omitting her last name. A mystery was more alluring. Just Lena? The question was soft, but it carried weight. For now. A tense silence settled between them. It wasn't awkward, but charged, filled with unspoken words. It was a test, a mutual assessment. Lena could feel his gaze on her, cataloging every detail. The way she held her glass, the subtle pulse in her neck, the way she refused to look away. He was used to women who flinched under his scrutiny. Lena forced herself to remain still, to meet his gaze head-on, to be his equal in this silent duel. This is madness, a voice screamed in her mind. This is a mistake. He can see right through you. But beneath the fear, something else, something more dangerous was bubbling. A spark of exhilaration. The thrill of dancing so close to the fire. She hated herself for it, for the weakness, for the way her body responded to him, a betrayal of the memory that drove her. "You're not from around here," he stated, not a question. "What makes you say that?" "No one in this room is looking at the city lights," he said, his tone low and confidential. "They're all looking at each other, wondering who has more power. You seem uninterested in the game." "Oh, I'm interested," she thought. "I'm just playing a different game." "Perhaps I find their game boring," she said aloud. The ghost of a smile touched his lips again. "Perhaps it is. Or perhaps you're just looking for a more interesting player." The challenge was laid, hanging in the air between them. Her plan was to infiltrate his world, but standing here, under the weight of his gaze, it felt as though he was the one holding the door open, and she didn't know if she was walking in as a guest or a prisoner. "I have an eye for rare and beautiful things, Lena," Frank said, his voice dropping to a murmur meant for her alone. "And you are the rarest thing I've seen in this room tonight." He raised his hand, not to touch her, but to take her empty glass. His fingers brushed against hers for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric, a jolt that shot through her, hot and unexpected. He passed the glass to a nearby waiter without a glance, his blue eyes still locked on hers. "Stay," he said. It wasn't a request. It was a softly spoken command. He turned and walked away, immediately swallowed by a group of suited men. Lena stood frozen, the spot where his fingers had touched hers tingling. She looked down at her own hands, which were now perfectly steady. The trembling was gone, replaced by an icy clarity. The first step of the plan was a success. She had his attention. But as she watched his powerful silhouette across the room, a terrifying truth settled in her heart. She had come to hunt a monster, but she had been unprepared for the man. And in the dangerous game that was about to begin, she wondered who was truly holding the bait and who was about to take the hook. The word hung in the air long after he was gone. Stay. It was a command wrapped in the thinnest veil of a suggestion, and it coiled in the pit of her stomach. For the next hour, Lena was a ghost at the feast. She drifted between conversations, a polite smile fixed on her lips, nodding at introductions to people whose names evaporated the moment she heard them. But her awareness, every taut nerve in her body, was tethered to him. She didn't need to look. She could feel his presence, a gravitational pull that warped the energy of the room around him. She felt his eyes on her periodically, a brief assessing glance that was as possessive as a hand on her skin. She was a chess piece he had just moved into play, and now he was observing the board, calculating his next 10 moves. The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. This was more difficult than she'd anticipated. It was one thing to plan a war from a distance, to study maps and profiles of the enemy. It was another thing entirely to be on the battlefield, breathing in the scent of gunpowder, and realizing the enemy was not a monster on a page, but a man of flesh, blood, and unnerving perception. As the night began to fray at the edges, the crowd thinned. The orchestra packed away their instruments, replaced by the muted clatter of staff clearing glasses. The grand ballroom, once a sea of vibrant life, now felt vast and empty, filled with echoes and shadows. Lena remained by the window, a solitary figure in red against the sprawling darkness of the city. She had stayed, as commanded. Now the move was his. The sound of his footsteps on the marble floor was unmistakable, each step deliberate and sure. He stopped beside her, and the silence stretched, thicker this time, more intimate in the cavernous, emptying room. "I trust your evening was tolerable," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It was an education," Lena replied, turning to face him. The mask of the mysterious guest was beginning to feel heavy. "Oh? And what did you learn?" He leaned a shoulder against the window frame, a casual posture that belied the intensity in his gaze. She chose her words carefully. "I learned that in a room full of people trying to shout, The quietest man is the one who is truly heard. A flicker of something surprise, respect, crossed his features before being suppressed. An astute observation. Most people are too busy making noise to listen. He studied her, his head tilted slightly. You listen. You watch. Why? Here was the precipice. One wrong word, one misstep, could send her tumbling. Her cover story had to be as seamless as her dress. I'm a student of human nature, she said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. It's a hobby. A dangerous hobby, he countered softly. Sometimes you see things you're not meant to see. Or you see the truth that everyone else is pretending isn't there. The words were out before she could stop them. A sliver of her true self breaking through the facade. Frank's eyes narrowed. He pushed off the window frame, his body seeming to fill the space between them without him taking a step. I have a foundation, an arts and antiquities trust. It's one of my more legitimate enterprises. The corner of his mouth twitched, acknowledging his own dark humor. I acquire pieces, sometimes from auctions, sometimes from private collections. It requires discretion and a keen eye for value, for what is authentic and what is a clever fake. Lena felt her heart begin to beat its frantic rhythm again. She knew where this was going. This was it. The door was creaking open. Why did it feel like the bars of a cage sliding shut? I'm looking for a consultant, he continued, his voice smooth as velvet. Someone to vet potential acquisitions, someone with a sharp eye and the ability to move in circles like this one without making noise. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Someone like you. The offer was ludicrous. She had no formal qualifications, no history he could check that would lead to this conclusion, which meant this wasn't a job offer. It was a test. It was a leash. He wasn't hiring a consultant. He was acquiring a curiosity, his rare and beautiful thing. Mr. Costello, I'm flattered, but I'm not sure I'm qualified, she said, injecting a note of hesitant honesty into her tone. It was crucial she didn't seem too eager. I'll be the judge of that, he dismissed, his tone final. You have an eye for truth. I saw it the moment I looked at you. That is a qualification that cannot be bought or taught. He watched her, waiting for her reaction, gauging her every flicker of emotion. The position is generous. It would require you to be available, to travel, sometimes on short notice, and it would demand absolute loyalty. Loyalty. The word was a slap. The irony was so bitter she could almost taste it. She was here to dismantle his empire, to repay a debt of blood, and he was speaking to her of loyalty. For a fleeting second, the image of a fire, of a kind face crumpled in grief, flashed behind her eyes. The raw, searing pain of it was a vital anchor. It reminded her why she was standing here, why she had to say yes. This isn't about you, she told herself fiercely. This is about them. I don't know what to say, she stammered, playing her part. Say yes, again the soft-spoken command. She met his gaze, holding it for a long moment. She let him see the feigned conflict in her eyes, the manufactured hesitation, before giving a slow, deliberate nod. Yes. A satisfaction, cold and deep, settled in his eyes. He had won. He had claimed his prize. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and produced a card. It was thick, heavy stock, matte black. He held it out to her. Lena took it. Her fingers brushed his again, and this time, the jolt was familiar, a dangerous current she was already learning to expect. There was no name on the card, no company, just a street address and a phone number embossed in stark silver. Be at this address tomorrow, 10 a.m. sharp, he said. We'll discuss the details of your employment. He straightened up, his presence once again becoming formal, distant. The transaction was complete. My driver will take you home. That won't be necessary, she said, a flicker of her own defiance returning. I can find my own way. For the first time that night, a genuine, mirthless smile touched Frank Costello's lips. I have no doubt that you can, Lena. But tonight, you'll take my car." His tone left no room for argument. It was a statement of fact, a reminder of who was in control. He turned and walked away without another word, leaving her alone in the silent ballroom, the black card feeling as heavy as a stone in her hand. The ride home was a blur of streetlights streaking across the polished leather of the town car's interior. The silence inside the vehicle was absolute, the driver a stoic shadow behind a pane of glass. Lena leaned her head back, the red silk of her dress feeling like a stranger's skin. The costume, the character she had played was gone, and all that was left was Lena, her heart a tangled knot of triumph and terror. She had done it. She was in. She had access, a plausible reason to be in his orbit. It was a victory far greater and far faster than she had dared to hope for. But the taste of it was not sweet. It was metallic, like blood. The proximity to him, the sheer force of his personality, was a variable she hadn't properly calculated. He wasn't just a name on a file, a faceless villain. He was a gravitational force, and she could already feel herself being pulled into his dangerous tide. She closed her eyes, and the memory she kept locked away broke free. A quiet suburban street, the smell of burning wood, the high-pitched wail of sirens growing closer, always too late, and a promise she had made to the ghost of her father, a whisper over a cold grave. Opening her eyes, she looked down at the black card in her hand. It was a key, a weapon, and perhaps a death sentence. She had walked into the lion's den, and the lion had just offered her a gilded cage. And tomorrow at 10 a.m., she would willingly walk inside and lock the door behind her. The next morning, the red dress lay pooled on a chair in her apartment, a discarded snakeskin. In its place, Lena chose armor of a different sort. A charcoal gray sheath dress, severe in its elegance, its high neckline and modest hem, a stark rebuke to the woman from the night before. Her hair was pulled back not in an elegant chignon, but a tight, functional ponytail. Today was not about seduction. It was about infiltration. She was a soldier reporting for duty. The thought was grim, but it steadied the tremor in her hands as she reapplied a neutral shade of lipstick. The address on the black card led her not to a shadowy warehouse or a gaudy mansion, but to a skyscraper of smoked glass and steel that speared the downtown sky. Costello Industries was etched in discreet silver lettering above the revolving doors. The lobby was a cathedral of corporate power, all gleaming marble and hushed efficiency. It smelled of clean, cold air and money. So much money. Lena felt a wave of nausea. This empire, polished and legitimized, was built on a foundation of broken lives, her family's included. She gave her name to the receptionist, a woman with a placid smile that didn't reach her eyes. Without a word, the woman tapped on a keyboard and then gestured towards a private elevator bank. "The penthouse floor. Mr. Costello is expecting you." There was no button to press inside the elevator. The doors slid shut with a soft, final hiss, and the car began its ascent, silent and unnervingly fast. Lena watched the floor numbers climb, each one a step higher into the clouds, a step further away from the solid ground of her old life. She pressed her palm flat against the cool steel wall, anchoring herself. "This is for Papa," she chanted in her mind, the words a desperate prayer. "This is for justice." The elevator opened directly into a reception area that was empty save for a single, massive abstract painting, a chaotic swirl of black and gold that seemed to absorb all sound. The carpet was so thick it muffled her footsteps, making her feel like a trespasser in a sacred space. A severe-looking woman in a dark suit appeared from a side door. "This way," was all she said. She led Lena down a wide, minimalist hallway to a pair of towering doors made of dark, polished wood. The woman opened one, held it, and then retreated, closing it behind Lena with a heavy, definitive click. The sound of the door closing echoed in the silence like a gunshot. Frank's office was not an office. It was a kingdom. An entire wall was a single pane of glass, offering a breathtaking, godlike view of the city sprawling below. The desk was a vast expanse of dark wood, empty except for a sleek laptop and a small, intricately carved jade dragon. The air smelled of aged leather, freshly brewed coffee, and the same faint, clean scent that clung to him. It was the scent of absolute control. He was not behind the desk. He stood by the window, his back to her, hands clasped behind him. He was looking down at his city. "They say that from a high enough vantage point," he said, his voice calm and resonant, not turning around. "People look like ants, insignificant, easy to crush." Lena's blood ran cold. It wasn't a casual observation. It was a statement of philosophy. It was a warning. "I think it depends on the person who's looking," she replied, her voice steady despite the frantic fluttering in her chest. He turned then, slowly. He wore another impeccable suit, this one a deep navy blue, but had forgone a tie. The open collar of his crisp white shirt lent him a relaxed air that was more menacing than any formality. His blue eyes swept over her, taking in her severe dress, her tight ponytail. He noted the transformation, and a flicker of something unreadable passed through his gaze. "An interesting answer," he said, moving away from the window. He didn't walk toward her, but paced along the length of the glass, his movements fluid and predatory, like a panther patrolling the edge of its territory. "Come here." Her feet felt like lead, but she obeyed, crossing the vast space until she stood beside him, the city spread at their feet. The height was dizzying. For a moment, she felt a terrifying, irrational urge to fall, to let the sky swallow her and end this charade. She clenched her fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. The small, sharp pain was a welcome anchor to reality. "I acquired something recently," he said, gesturing to a low table she hadn't noticed before. On it sat 2 identical Roman coins, their surfaces greened with age. One is a genuine silver denarius from the reign of Emperor Tiberius, a priceless piece of history. The other is a forgery, a brilliant one, crafted in Istanbul just last year. Tell me which is which. This was it. The test. It had nothing to do with art and everything to do with her. He was testing her nerve, her intuition, her ability to see past the surface. She felt a cold sweat prickle her hairline. She knew nothing about Roman coins. She took a deep breath, forcing the panic down. She couldn't show ignorance. She couldn't show weakness. She had to play the part he had cast her in, the woman with an eye for truth. Lena bent over the table, her mind racing. She didn't look at the details of the coins, the profiles of the Caesars, or the Latin inscriptions. She wouldn't be able to spot a flaw there. Instead, she tried to feel them. She remembered her father, an architect, telling her that old things have a weight to them, a soul. Look at the story, Lena, not just the structure. She let her eyes unfocus slightly. One coin seemed to sit inert on the velvet cloth. It was perfect, almost too perfect. Its edges were crisp, the image sharp. The other seemed different. Its edges were softer, worn smooth by 1,000 hands, 1,000 pockets, 2,000 years of existence. There was a microscopic nick near the emperor's chin, an imperfection that spoke not of a forger's error, but of a life lived. It had a presence, a weight. She straightened up and looked directly at Frank. She pointed to the second coin, the imperfect one. "This is the real one," she stated, her voice holding a conviction she did not feel. "The other one is trying too hard. History is never perfect. It's the flaws that tell the true story." Frank's face was unreadable. He stared at her for a long, silent moment, and Lena felt as if her entire soul was being weighed and measured. She had gambled everything on a piece of half-remembered philosophy and a gut feeling. He walked over to the table and picked up the coin she had pointed to. He turned it over in his fingers. "Correct," he said, his voice flat. He dropped the coin back onto the velvet, the soft thud deafening in the quiet room. The flaws. An interesting way to see the world. He moved to his desk then, finally sitting behind it, the vast expanse of wood once again a barrier between them. He opened a drawer and pulled out a slim file, sliding it across the polished surface toward her. "Your first assignment," he said, "all business now. A private collector in Geneva is selling a collection of Renaissance maps. He claims they belong to the Medici family. The auction is private, by invitation only, in 3 days. I want you to go. Observe. Report back to me on the authenticity of the maps, and more importantly, on the other bidders in the room. I want to know who is there, who they talk to, and what they are truly trying to buy. Geneva. He was sending her away, into the heart of his world of clandestine deals and powerful players. It was happening too fast. She felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. The file contains your travel documents, reservations, and a generous advance for expenses, he continued, steepling his fingers, his cold blue eyes pinning her in place. You will be an art consultant for the Costello Trust. You will answer to no one but me. She picked up the file. It felt heavy, burdened with the weight of her deception. I understand, she said, her throat dry. I hope you do, Lena, he said softly, a dangerous edge to his voice. Because in my world, there is no room for flaws, or for mistakes. The dismissal was clear. She nodded, turned, and walked toward the heavy wooden doors, feeling his gaze on her back with every step. As her hand touched the cool brass handle, his voice stopped her one last time. Lena. She turned to face him. The dress, he said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. It's a definite improvement, but I confess, I preferred the red. And with that, he turned his attention back to his laptop, leaving her to flee his kingdom with a racing heart and the chilling realization that Frank Costello didn't miss a single thing. She had passed his test, but she felt less like an employee and more like a fly that had just been welcomed into a spider's web. Geneva was a city of pristine, cold beauty. From her suite at the Beau Rivage, Lena had a panoramic view of the lake, its surface a placid sheet of sapphire reflecting the snow-dusted Alps. The air that drifted through the open balcony door was crisp and clean, smelling of water and wealth. Everything was orderly, quiet, and perfect. It felt like a beautiful, sterile prison. The luxury was suffocating. A complimentary bottle of champagne sat sweating in a silver bucket. A bowl of exotic fruit, arranged like a still-life painting, rested on a mahogany table. A walk-in closet held the clothes Frank's assistant had arranged for her. A curated collection of understated, powerful pieces from designers Lena only knew from magazines. It was another costume for another role. Every perfectly folded sweater, every sleek pair of shoes, was a reminder that she was not here as herself. She was an extension of Frank Costello's will, a carefully chosen piece to be moved across his international board. She spent the first day buried in the research materials from the file, her hotel room transformed into a study. She memorized the names of cartographers, the watermarks of 16th century paper, the subtle shifts in ink composition used by Florentine masters. It was a cram session for the most important exam of her life. Yet, she knew Frank hadn't sent her here for her expertise in cartography. He had sent her for her eyes and ears. He had sent her to see the flaws. The night of the auction, she selected a simple, long-sleeved black dress. It was a whisper, not a shout, designed to make her blend into the opulent shadows. As she fastened a single pearl earring, she met her own gaze in the mirror. The woman looking back was a stranger composed, cool, her eyes holding a depth of calculation that was new and unsettling. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a veneer of hardened resolve. She was no longer just a girl bent on revenge. She was becoming the weapon she needed to be. The auction was held in a private villa, nestled in the hills overlooking the city. The air inside was thick with the scent of beeswax, old paper, and the collective aroma of discreetly expensive perfumes. The attendees were a curated collection of the global elite. Russian oligarchs with stony faces, elegant French industrialists, and sun-weathered men who could have been anything from Texas oil barons to South American tycoons. They spoke in hushed tones, their polite smiles barely concealing the predatory glint in their eyes. This was a different kind of jungle from the one Frank ruled back home, but the laws were the same. The strong consumed the weak. Lena found a position near the back, a glass of mineral water in her hand, her posture relaxed, but her senses on high alert. The maps were displayed in climate-controlled glass cases, their faded ink tracing lost coastlines and forgotten empires. They were beautiful, but Lena's focus was elsewhere. She watched the hands of the other guests, a man whose fingers drummed impatiently on his thigh, a woman who twisted a diamond ring, her gaze darting between a specific map and a rival bidder. These were the tells, the small betrayals of emotion that revealed the truth behind the masks. They are magnificent, are they not? To hold a piece of the world as it was once imagined. The voice was smooth, accented with Parisian French, and it came from just beside her. Lena turned to see a man in a perfectly tailored gray suit, his silver hair swept back from a handsome, tanned face. He was smiling at her, a charming, easy smile that seemed out of place in the tense room. "They hold the dreams of old kings," Lena replied, her voice even. "A poetic way to see them." He extended a hand. "Julien Dubois." She took his hand. His grip was firm but gentle. "Lena?" "Just Lena?" he asked, his eyes twinkling, echoing Frank's question from that first night. "A woman of mystery. I like that." He gestured toward the maps. "Are you a collector?" "A consultant," she said, using the title Frank had given her. It felt foreign and false on her tongue. "Ah, for whom, may I ask? Or is that part of the mystery?" His charm was relentless, a gentle but persistent pressure. "My client values discretion," she said, her smile polite but firm. "Of course, all the interesting ones do." He didn't press further. Instead, he stood beside her, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. A fascinating collection of people as well. More predators than scholars, I think. Everyone here is bidding on something more than just paper and ink. They are bidding for status, for history, for a piece of a story they can claim as their own. He was perceptive. Dangerously so. He looked at her, his smile softening slightly. "You, for instance. You are not looking at the maps. You are looking at the bidders. You look at them the way a historian looks at a manuscript searching for the forgery." His observation landed like a stone, sending ripples through her carefully constructed composure. A flush of heat crept up her neck, a betrayal she tried to suppress. "I'm simply trying to understand the market," she deflected, turning her attention pointedly toward the front of the room where the auctioneer was tapping his gavel for attention. "The market has very little to do with the art," Julien murmured, his voice low enough for only her to hear, "and everything to do with the artists of the deal." The bidding began. The auctioneer's voice was a calm, melodic drone, a stark contrast to the silent, vicious battles being waged with subtle nods and the flick of a numbered paddle. Lena tuned it out, her focus narrowing on two men Frank's file had identified as key rivals, a grim-faced Russian named Petrov and a German industrialist, von Hess. They were seated on opposite sides of the room, ostensibly bidding against each other for a particularly rare portolan chart. The price climbed, jumping in increments of 50,000 francs. Petrov would bid. Von Hess would counter. Back and forth it went, a predictable, aggressive tennis match. But Lena noticed something else. She saw the infinitesimal glance Petrov gave to a third man, a nondescript individual in the row behind her, just before making a particularly bold bid. She saw von Hess subtly shake his head when his own associate started to raise a paddle, waving him off. It was theater. They weren't fighting each other. They were working in concert, a pincer movement designed to inflate the price and drive out any legitimate competition. Finally, when the price reached a staggering sum and all other bidders had fallen away, a new paddle went up. It belonged to the nondescript man behind her. Petrov and von Hess immediately fell silent. The gavel came down. "Sold," the auctioneer declared, "to bidder number 73. It was a brilliant, ruthless piece of market manipulation. An alliance hidden in plain sight. This was the kind of intelligence Frank craved. Not just who won, but how they won, and who their silent partners were. She felt a cold sense of accomplishment. She had seen the flaw in the story everyone else was watching. As the crowd began to disperse, mingling for a final glass of champagne, Julien reappeared at her side. An interesting outcome for the Portolan chart, he said, his eyes sharp with amusement. Did your client get what they wanted? My client received exactly the information they needed, Lena said, her tone deliberately neutral. I see. He smiled, a genuine, knowing smile this time. He reached into his jacket and produced a card, much like Frank's. But it was cream-colored, with elegant embossed script. Julien Dubois, Antiquities. It listed addresses in Paris and London. If you ever find your consultancy work brings you to Paris, the mystery would be a welcome challenge. I find the market here a bit too predictable. He gave a slight bow, a gesture of old-world charm, and was gone, melting back into the crowd of predators and scholars. Lena left the villa soon after, not bothering with a final drink. The crisp night air was a relief against her flushed skin. The weight of the performance lifted, but the weight of the knowledge she now possessed settled heavily in its place. She had the information, the names, the hidden alliance. She had the weapon Frank had sent her to acquire. Back in the sterile silence of her hotel suite, the view of the placid lake seemed to mock her. She stood in the center of the room, the opulence feeling more alien and obscene than ever. She had succeeded. She was a good spy. A cold, hollow feeling opened up inside her. Her father had been a builder, a man who created things. She was becoming an instrument of destruction. She walked over to the phone on the bedside table. It was the middle of the day back in the States. Frank would be in his office, his kingdom in the sky, waiting. The thought of his voice, calm and commanding, sent a shiver of apprehension down her spine. Reporting to him wasn't just completing a task. It was feeding the beast. It was proving her worth, embedding herself deeper into the very world that had destroyed her own. Her hand hovered over the receiver, her reflection a pale, distorted ghost in the polished surface of the phone. She had the truth, and now she had to deliver it to the one man who would know exactly how to use it. The phone call was brief and surgically precise. Lena delivered her findings in a flat, emotionless tone, reporting on the staged bidding war and the silent partnership between Petrov and von Hess. She detailed the name of the man who was their proxy, Bidder 73. She did not offer opinions or analysis, only facts. On the other end of the line, Frank was silent, a vast listening void. The silence was more unnerving than any interrogation. When she finished, there was a pause so long she thought the line had gone dead. You see the strings, he finally said, his voice a low murmur that sent a shiver down her spine despite the thousands of miles between them. Not just the puppets. Well done. Come home. The line clicked dead. It wasn't a conversation. It was a summons. 24 hours later, she was standing outside the polished wooden doors to his office once again. This time, there was no hesitation. The severe-looking assistant simply nodded as she approached and opened the door for her, as if her presence was now an expected, integrated part of this cold, efficient machine. Frank was behind his desk, a phone pressed to his ear, speaking in rapid, low Italian. He gestured for her to sit in one of the leather chairs opposite him. It was the first time she'd been invited to sit. The gesture was a subtle but significant shift in their dynamic. She was no longer just a curiosity to be observed. She was a player being brought to the table. She sat, her back straight, her hands clasped in her lap, and waited. She watched him, studying the hard lines of his face as he listened, the way his jaw tightened at something the person on the other end said. He exuded a kind of predatory stillness, a contained energy that made the vast office feel small and charged. Finally, he ended the call with a curt, final-sounding phrase and placed the phone down. The silence descended again. Petrov and von Hess have been thorns in my side for months, he said, breaking the quiet. His blue eyes fixed on her. They were not cold and assessing today. They were sharp, focused, like a hawk spotting its prey from a great height. They've been blocking a shipping expansion I'm planning in the Baltic. Art auctions are how they launder their money and communicate with their associates under a veneer of legitimacy. The information you brought me, it gives me leverage. It gives me a crowbar to pry open their little alliance. He spoke of it so clinically. A world of power and violence reduced to a simple business transaction. Lena felt the familiar knot of revulsion tighten in her gut, but she kept her face a placid mask. "I'm glad the information was useful," she said, her voice a carefully modulated neutral. "Useful?" The corner of his mouth twitched. "Lena, it was masterful. You did in one night what my other sources have failed to do in 6 months." The praise, direct and unexpected, was more disarming than any threat. It sent a confusing warmth through her, a flush of pride she immediately hated herself for feeling. She was here to destroy this man, not to earn his approval. She averted her gaze, looking at the small jade dragon on his desk. Frank noticed the direction of her gaze. He leaned forward, the faint scent of his coffee and the clean, cold scent of his presence drifting across the desk. "Do you like it?" he asked, his voice softer. "It's beautiful," she admitted. He picked it up, cradling the small, intricately carved object in his large hand. The gesture seemed almost tender. "My grandfather gave it to me. He was an immigrant. Came here with nothing but the clothes on his back and a chip on his shoulder the size of Sicily. He told me this dragon represents power, strength, and good fortune. But he also told me its true value is in its flaw." He turned the dragon over. On the underside, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a tiny hairline crack in the jade. "He said that everything, no matter how powerful, has a crack," Frank continued, his voice a low, intimate murmur. "A vulnerability. The secret to winning isn't to be flawless. It's to know your own flaws, protect them, and find the flaws in your enemies." His eyes lifted from the dragon and met hers, and the intensity in them made the air in the room feel thin. "You have a gift for finding them." He was no longer talking about maps or coins. He was talking about her, about them. He stood up, the movement fluid and silent. He walked around the massive desk, removing the barrier between them. Lena's heart began to hammer against her ribs. She stayed seated, a primal instinct screaming at her to run, while a darker, more treacherous part of her was rooted to the spot, captivated. He stopped directly in front of her chair, forcing her to tilt her head back to look up at him. His sheer size, his physical presence, was overwhelming. He blocked the light from the window, casting her in his shadow. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the faint dark stubble along his jaw, could smell the whiskey, faint and sharp, on his breath. "I need that gift, Lena," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "I need your eyes, your loyalty." She wanted to spit the word back in his face, to tell him what he had taken from her, what his world had done to her family. The vengeful words were a scream on the tip of her tongue, but they died there, strangled by the complexity of the moment. She had to stay. She had to see this through. "You have it," she whispered, the 2 words costing her more than he could ever know. His gaze dropped to her mouth. For a heart-stopping second, she thought he was going to kiss her. The air between them crackled, a live wire of unspoken questions and forbidden answers. She could feel the warmth of his breath on her skin. Her own breathing hitched. It was madness. It was wrong. And yet, every cell in her body was screamingly aware of him, of his proximity, of the dangerous magnetic pull he exerted. But he didn't kiss her. He didn't touch her at all. He held himself perfectly still for a moment longer. A test of will, a demonstration of the iron control he held over himself, and by extension, over her. Then he took a half step back, the spell breaking. The air rushed back into her lungs, and she felt a dizzying sense of both relief and a strange, sharp pang of disappointment. He returned to his desk, all business once more, the brief, intense moment of intimacy vanishing as if it had never happened. "There's a shipment coming into the port of Newark next week," he said, his tone clipped and professional. "Officially, it's Italian marble. Unofficially, it's something else. There are people who want to intercept it. I need you there. I need you to watch, to be my eyes on the ground." This was different. This wasn't a glittering auction in Geneva. This was the docks. This was the gritty, dangerous reality of his business. This was a step deeper into the darkness. "What will I be looking for?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. "Flaws," he said simply, his blue eyes locking with hers across the expanse of the desk. "You'll know one when you see it." He dismissed her with a nod. Lena stood, her legs feeling unsteady. She walked out of the office, the heavy doors closing behind her, the sound sealing her fate. As she rode the silent elevator down, she brought a trembling hand to her lips. They tingled, as if he had kissed her after all. She had gone into his office a soldier. She had walked out a confidant. The line between her mission and her role was blurring into a dangerous gray, and she was beginning to fear that the biggest flaw Frank Costello had was the one he was starting to see in her, a reflection of himself, and she was terrified that he might be right. The port of Newark at night was a different world. It was a mechanical, skeletal beast, all sharp angles and deep shadows under the sickly orange glow of the sodium lamps. The air, thick and heavy, was a harsh cocktail of salt, rust, and diesel fuel. It clung to the back of her throat. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal and the low, guttural groan of heavy machinery were the monster's sleeping breaths. This was the engine room of Frank's empire, a place worlds away from the perfumed air of a Geneva villa. This was where the real work was done. Lena sat in the passenger seat of a black sedan, parked in the deep shadows between two towering stacks of shipping containers. She wore dark jeans, a black turtleneck sweater, and a heavy coat. The glamorous costumes were gone. This was her uniform for the front lines. The man in the driver's seat had introduced himself as Sal. He was built like a refrigerator, with a shaved head and a flattened nose that suggested it had been broken more than once. He hadn't spoken more than 10 words to her since picking her up, his silence a heavy cloak of disapproval. She was an outsider, a woman, and clearly, in his eyes, a liability. She could feel his skepticism radiating from him in waves. He was one of Frank's men, a soldier. She was... what? A consultant? The title felt absurd here. She was Frank's pet project, and Sal had been assigned babysitting duty. The thought hardened her resolve. She would not be dismissed. For 2 hours they sat in silence, watching. The dock was a slow, methodical ballet of cranes and forklifts. Men in hard hats moved in and out of the pools of light, their voices carrying on the wind in clipped, indistinct shouts. Lena's eyes scanned everything, moving past the obvious and searching for the subtle. She watched the patterns of the workers, the rhythm of the machinery, the way the security guards made their rounds. She was looking for a break in the rhythm, a missed beat in the heart of the machine. Her mind drifted back to the moment in Frank's office, the feeling of his presence, the heat from his body, the unspoken challenge in his eyes. It was a memory that unsettled her, a dangerous melody she couldn't get out of her head. He had seen something in her, a capacity for this world that she had never wanted to acknowledge in herself. And standing on the precipice of real danger, she feared he was right. There was a part of her, a cold, sharp-edged part, that was unnervingly calm, unnervingly focused. The daughter of the man of justice was proving to be disturbingly good at the work of criminals. "Ship's here," Sal grunted, his voice pulling her back to the present. A massive container ship, the Palermo Queen, was being nudged into its berth by tugboats, its immense black hull blotting out the stars. The ballet on the docks picked up its tempo. A specific crane lumbered to life, moving toward the ship. The official cargo was marble, but Lena knew that somewhere in the ship's belly were a few select containers that held something far more valuable and far more illegal. "We're watching the crew at Bay 12, Sal said, pointing. "The containers are marked with a blue X. They get loaded onto a convoy of 3 trucks. Simple. Our guys are on the trucks and blended with the dock crew. Anything looks out of place, you tell me." His tone was flat, implying he didn't expect her to see anything his experienced eyes would miss. Lena ignored his tone and focused. The first designated container was lifted from the ship, a giant metal box swinging through the air like a child's toy. It was placed on the back of a flatbed truck. The process was smooth, efficient. Too smooth. She felt a prickle of unease at the base of her neck. History is never perfect, she had told Frank. She scanned the scene again, not looking at the container, but at the people around it. That's when she saw it. A flaw. It was small, almost insignificant. One of the dock workers, a man in a grease-stained jacket standing near the truck, was not watching the container. In a place where a falling multi-ton box was a constant threat, everyone watched the cranes. But this man, he was watching the gate. He kept glancing towards the main entrance of the port, a subtle, repetitive turn of his head. He pulled a pack of cigarettes from his pocket, his hands fumbling slightly. He lit one, the small flare of the match illuminating a face slick with sweat, despite the cold night air. "Sal," Lena said, her voice quiet but firm. "I see it, all clear," he grunted, his eyes on the truck. "No. Look at the man by the front wheel of the truck. The one smoking." Sal's gaze shifted, his eyes narrowing. "He's just a dock worker. What about him?" "He's nervous," Lena said, "and he's not watching the load. He's watching the gate. He's waiting for something." Sal stared for a long moment. She could feel his skepticism warring with the ingrained habit of following an order, even a suggestion from this strange woman. "Could be anything," he finally said, but there was a new note of uncertainty in his voice. "His hands are shaking," Lena pressed, "and he just lit a filtered cigarette from the wrong end." Sal's head snapped back to the man. It was true. The tiny orange glow was at the white, filtered tip, a mistake no smoker would ever make unless their mind was entirely elsewhere. It was a tiny, stupid human error. A perfect flaw. "Son of a bitch," Sal breathed. The disbelief in his voice was gone, replaced by a sudden, sharp-edged tension. He reached for the radio clip to his visor. "He's a spotter. There's a welcoming committee." He spoke a few curt words of code into the radio. "The package has a shadow. Gate watch is compromised." The response was a crackle of static and a single clipped word of acknowledgement. Instantly, the atmosphere on the dock shifted. It was almost imperceptible, but Lena felt it. The movements of the men she now knew were Frank's people became more deliberate, their postures changing. A forklift that had been idling nearby suddenly moved, its heavy tines blocking a key access route. Another man, one of the truck drivers, casually climbed down from his cab, stretching, but his hand rested near the small of his back. They were preparing. The spotter must have seen the shift, too. He dropped his cigarette, his head whipping around, his eyes wide with panic. He started to back away, turning to run. And then all hell broke loose. The main gate burst open and two black SUVs, their lights off, screamed onto the docks, their tires screeching on the pavement. But they weren't heading for the truck with the container. They were heading for the trap Frank's men had just set. Lena didn't hear gunshots. She heard the brutal, sickening crunch of metal as the forklift swung its heavy tines into the side of the lead SUV, flipping it onto its side. She saw men spill out of the second vehicle, but they were immediately swarmed by dock workers who seemed to materialize from the shadows. There were shouts, the sounds of scuffling, and then a sudden, chilling silence. It was over in less than 30 seconds. Brutal. Efficient. Terrifying. Sal was already starting the car. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice a low growl. He pulled the sedan out from behind the containers and sped towards a different, smaller exit on the far side of the port. Lena didn't look back. She stared straight ahead, her heart pounding a wild, frantic rhythm against her ribs. The adrenaline was a hot, metallic taste in her mouth. She had seen it. The flaw. And her observation had sprung a trap. A violent, perfectly executed countermove. She hadn't just watched. She had participated. Sal didn't speak until they were miles away from the port. Back on the highway, the city lights a distant, indifferent glow. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice raw with a grudging respect. "About the cigarette?" Lena leaned her head back against the cool leather of the seat, her body trembling now that the danger had passed. "People make mistakes when they're scared," she said, her voice hollow. "You just have to be watching for them." He glanced at her, a long, searching look. The open hostility was gone, replaced by something else. Awe, fear, respect. He saw her now, not as Frank's pet, but as something else entirely. something dangerous. And in the darkness of the car, speeding away from the quiet violence she had helped unleash, Lena finally had to confront the terrifying truth. He wasn't the only one. She was starting to see it in herself too. The aftermath of the docks was silence. For 3 days, Lena heard nothing. She stayed in her apartment, the city outside her window feeling like a world away. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a low, humming anxiety and a profound sense of dislocation. She replayed the events in her mind, the screech of tires, the horrifying crunch of metal. She had been the catalyst for that violence. The thought was a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. She had set out to expose a world of brutality, but instead, she was becoming an expert in its mechanics. She found herself looking in the mirror and not recognizing the woman who stared back. Her eyes seemed darker, her expression more guarded. The soft edges of the girl who had mourned her father were being honed into something sharp and hard. Was this what justice required? Or was this the cost of vengeance becoming the very thing you sought to destroy? The question haunted the long, silent hours. On the 4th day, the summons came. It wasn't a call, but a knock on her door. Sal stood in the hallway, his large frame filling the doorway. He wasn't wearing his usual dock worker disguise, but a dark suit that made him look even more imposing, like a bodyguard or an undertaker. "Frank wants to see you," he said. His tone was different now. The grudging respect he'd shown in the car had solidified. "Not at the office. He's at the SEMA Club." Lena knew the name. The SEMA Club was one of the most exclusive, old-world Italian social clubs in the city. A place where men like Frank conducted business over plates of pasta and glasses of red wine. Their conversations shielded by decades of tradition and an unwritten code of silence. It was the heart of his territory, a place no outsider was ever invited. This was more than a debriefing. This was an anointment. The drive was silent, but it was a different silence than before. It was no longer fraught with tension and disapproval. It was the quiet of shared experience, a grim acknowledgement of the line they had crossed together at the port. The SEMA Club had no sign. It was a simple brownstone on a quiet, tree-lined street, its windows dark and uninviting. Sal led her down a short flight of stairs to a heavy wooden door. He knocked a specific, rhythmic pattern. A small grate slid open. A pair of eyes peered out, and then the door swung inward. The air inside was warm and thick with the smells of garlic, olive oil, and cigar smoke. The room was dimly lit, paneled in dark wood, the tables covered in white linen. It was a caricature of a Mafia den, but the men who sat at the tables were anything but caricatures. They were older, their faces etched with the hard lines of lives lived in the shadows. They watched her entrance, their conversations faltering, their eyes hard and assessing. The room fell into a heavy, watchful silence. Lena felt 100 years of history and suspicion directed at her, a single unfamiliar woman in their sacred space. Frank was at a table in the back, in a secluded alcove. He was not alone. An older, impeccably dressed man with a mane of silver hair and eyes as shrewd as a fox's sat with him. Frank rose as she approached, a gesture of respect that did not go unnoticed by the other occupants of the room. The silence deepened. "Lena," he said, his voice a calm anchor in the sea of hostile stares. "This is my uncle, Nico Costello. Nico, this is Lena, the consultant I told you about." Nico did not stand. He appraised her from his seat, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. He gestured to the empty chair. "Sit, child." The command was soft, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. This was the patriarch, the true power behind the throne. Lena sat, her back ramrod straight. She could feel the weight of Nico's scrutiny, a pressure far more intense than Frank's had ever been. Frank's gaze was analytical, his uncle's was soulful. It felt as if he were looking directly into her past. "Frank tells me you have a rare talent," Nico said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "He says you see things others miss. He told me what you saw at the port. The cigarette. A small thing. But small things can topple empires." Lena simply nodded, her throat too dry to speak. "This business you prevented," Nico continued, swirling the dark red wine in his glass. It was the work of the Antonelli family, a new generation, young, foolish boys who think violence is a substitute for strategy. They have been a nuisance. Your insight has given us an opportunity to turn a nuisance into an advantage. A waiter appeared, placing a glass of the same red wine in front of her. The gesture was clearly prearranged. An acceptance. "The man you spotted," Frank interjected, his voice cool and businesslike. "The spotter. We had a conversation with him. He was very cooperative. He confirmed it was an Antonelli operation. He also gave us the location of a warehouse where they store their untaxed liquor shipments. An embarrassing and costly loss for them, should the authorities happen to receive an anonymous tip." Lena felt a chill. The fumbling, sweaty man from the docks. She could picture his terrified face. "We had a conversation with him." The euphemism was terrifying. She had identified him, and in doing so, had signed his death warrant. Or worse. "Strategy," Nico murmured, taking a sip of his wine. He looked at Lena over the rim of his glass. "That is what we value. Not the brute force of a gun, but the subtle art of positioning, of knowing when to press, when to withdraw, and when to set a trap. Frank has the mind for it. But his temper, it is a fire. Sometimes it forges steel. Other times it burns the house down. He needs a calm eye beside him. A steady hand." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "He seems to think you have that." It was a coronation. In this den of killers and thieves, this old man was anointing her. He was validating her role, cementing her place at Frank's side. The irony was a physical sickness rising in her throat. She had come to tear them apart from the inside. And here was the old king, inviting her into the heart of the family. "I simply report what I see," Lena said, her voice barely a whisper. Nico smiled, a slow, grim stretching of his thin lips. "And what do you see now, child? Here, in this room?" The question was a test, the final test. She let her gaze sweep across the room, meeting the hard stares of the men who were still watching them. She saw suspicion, yes, but underneath it, she saw something else. Absolute, unwavering loyalty. Not just to Frank, but to the old man beside him, to the family, to the code. "I see a foundation," she said, choosing her words with infinite care. "Something built to last. Something that people are willing to protect." Nico's smile widened slightly. He looked at Frank and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a sign of approval, of transference. He had officially sanctioned Frank's judgment, and by extension, her. The silent tension in the room finally broke. Conversations resumed, the volume rising to a low hum. The trial was over. Frank drove her home himself that night. Sal was gone. The city slid past the windows of his town car, a blur of anonymous lights. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The air in the car was thick with the unspoken events of the evening. "Nico likes you," Frank said finally, breaking the silence. "He doesn't like anyone." "I'm not sure 'like' is the right word," Lena replied, her voice strained. "He respects you," Frank corrected. "It's better. Like is fleeting. Respect is a currency. In our world, it's the only currency that matters." He pulled the car to a stop in front of her apartment building. He didn't move to let her out. He turned in his seat, his arm resting on the back of the bench, his body angled toward her. The space inside the car suddenly felt impossibly small, charged with a dangerous, electric intimacy. "What you did at the docks, Lena," he began, his voice low and serious. "You saved lives. My men's lives. They see that. I see that." He reached out, his hand moving slowly, deliberately. He didn't touch her face. He gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his knuckles grazing her skin. The touch was feather-light, but it burned like a brand. It was a gesture of profound, terrifying intimacy. More intimate than a kiss. It was a gesture of possession, of gratitude, of a bond forged in shared violence. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She stared into his eyes, those chips of blue ice, and for the first time, she thought she saw something beyond the cold calculation. A flicker of heat, a hint of vulnerability, a crack in the jade. "Be careful, Frank," she heard herself whisper, the words an involuntary betrayal of her mission. His eyes darkened and his hand fell away. The moment was gone. "Go inside, Lena," he said, his voice a rough rasp. "Get some rest." She got out of the car without another word, and didn't look back as he drove away. She leaned against the cold brick of her building, her cheek still tingling from his touch. She had come here seeking to be a fire that would consume his world. But she was standing too close to the flames, and the terrifying truth was, she was starting to enjoy the warmth. The weeks that followed settled into a strange, unnerving rhythm. Lena was no longer summoned. She was simply expected. She found herself spending more time in the cold, minimalist world of the Costello Industries penthouse than in her own apartment. She wasn't just a consultant anymore. She was a strategist, a shadow cabinet of one. Frank would present her with problems, a rival encroaching on his territory, a politician who needed convincing, a seemingly legitimate business deal that felt off. He didn't want solutions from her. He wanted her to find the flaw, the single loose thread that, when pulled, would unravel the entire tapestry. And she was terrifyingly good at it. She saw the greed behind a philanthropic gesture, the fear masked by a bully's bravado, the hidden debt that motivated a supposedly loyal partner. She moved through Frank's world like a ghost, her quiet presence and sharp eyes becoming a known and feared quantity among his inner circle. Sal would nod to her with respect. The severe assistant would bring her coffee without being asked. She was being woven into the fabric of the organization, her threads becoming indistinguishable from the rest. One evening, they were in his private apartment, a sprawling space directly above the office. Unlike the cold corporate kingdom below, this space was more personal, though no less controlled. It was all clean lines, dark woods, and vast windows that drank in the glittering city. There were no family photos, no clutter, just a curated collection of art, a wall of books, and an overwhelming sense of solitude. They sat in near darkness, the only light coming from the silent television screen. A local news report was on, detailing an early morning raid by federal agents on a warehouse in Queens. The lead story was about a massive seizure of untaxed liquor. The Antonelli family's name was mentioned. The reporter spoke of an anonymous tip. Frank swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clinking softly. "A costly and embarrassing loss for them," he said, his voice a low, satisfied rumble. He wasn't looking at the TV. He was looking at her. "Your work." Lena stared at the screen, at the flashing lights of the police cars, at the crates being carried out by agents. That was her. She had done that. She had taken a piece from a rival family with nothing but a quiet observation and a phone call. The power of it was a dizzying, sickening poison. She took a sip of the whiskey he had poured for her, the burn a welcome distraction. "You're quiet tonight," he observed. "Just thinking," she said, her voice tight. "About?" She turned to face him, emboldened by the whiskey and the strange intimacy of the darkened room. "About you," she said, the honesty of it surprising them both. "Why this? You could have been anything. This building, the legitimate businesses. It's more than enough. Why the rest of it?" It was a direct probe, a search for the ultimate flaw in the man himself. He didn't get angry. He didn't evade. He stared into his glass for a long moment, the city lights reflecting in the dark liquid. "My father," he said, the words quiet, stripped of his usual authority. "He was a good man, a kind man. He tried to run my grandfather's business the right way, with a soft hand. He believed in things like honor among thieves. He trusted the wrong people. He was weak." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. The Antonelli family of his generation. They weren't a nuisance. They were a threat. They saw his kindness as an opportunity. They came for him. Not with guns, but with paper. They bankrupted him, broke him, humiliated him. I was 16 when I watched him sell my mother's wedding ring to pay a debt. He died a year later. A heart attack, the doctor said. But he died of a broken spirit. He finally lifted his gaze to meet hers. The ice in his eyes had melted, and for the first time, she saw the fire beneath. It wasn't the cold fire of a predator. It was the hot, painful fire of a boy who had watched his world burn. I made a promise to myself on the day we buried him, Frank said, his voice a raw whisper. I would never be weak. I would never trust the wrong people. I would build an empire so strong, so impenetrable, that no one could ever take anything from me again. I will not be my father. Lena's breath caught in her chest. His story, his vow, was a perfect, tragic mirror of her own. She, who had sworn vengeance for her father, was sitting with a man who had built an empire on the same promise. They were two sides of the same coin, forged in the same fire of loss. The revelation shook her to her core. How could she destroy a man whose motivations she understood so profoundly? The confession hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge of shared pain. The chasm between them of hunter and hunted, of victim and perpetrator, was suddenly, terrifyingly, gone. All that was left was a man and a woman, both haunted by the ghosts of their fathers. He stood up and walked to the window, his back to her. The Antonellis today are the children of the men who destroyed him. This isn't just business for me, Lena. It's poetry. She rose and went to stand beside him, drawn by an invisible force she could no longer fight. They stood in silence, shoulder to shoulder, looking down at the city he had conquered. He would have been proud of you, she said softly, the words an act of treason against her own past. He turned his head, his face inches from hers. The air grew thick, heavy. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the gratitude warring with a lifetime of guarded control. He would have been terrified of what I've become, he countered, his voice rough. His gaze dropped to her lips, and the world seemed to shrink to the space between them. This time, there was no desk, no audience, just the two of them, suspended in the sky, surrounded by the ghosts of their past. He lifted a hand, his fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before they gently touched her jaw, his thumb stroking the soft skin just below her ear. The touch was an inferno. Her carefully constructed walls, already weakened by his confession, crumbled to dust. Her mission, her vengeance, all of it evaporated in the searing heat of his touch. All that existed was the raw, undeniable truth. She wanted him. It was a terrifying, self-destructive, and overwhelming truth. She leaned into his hand, a gesture of surrender. His eyes darkened, and he lowered his head, slowly, inexorably. His lips were about to meet hers. It was inevitable, a collision course set in motion from the moment she first walked into that ballroom. But just as their lips were about to touch, she flinched. A flicker of an image, her father's smiling face flashed behind her eyes. It was a desperate last-ditch act of self-preservation. Frank felt the infinitesimal movement, the ghost of her resistance. And he stopped. The control she had so admired, so feared, slammed back into place. He held her gaze for one more heart-stopping second, a silent question passing between them, before he let his hand drop. The heat was gone, leaving the air cold and empty. "It's late," he said, his voice thick. He turned away from her, putting a wall of glass and city lights between them once more. The moment was shattered. The fragile bridge was broken. "Yes," she whispered to his reflection in the window. "It is." She left his apartment, her body trembling, her mind a chaotic storm. She had nearly succumbed. She had nearly betrayed everything she stood for a man she was supposed to hate. As she walked the cold, empty streets back to her apartment, she clutched the small, worn photograph of her father in her coat pocket. It felt like a cold stone. His memory, which had once been her guiding star, was now just a painful reminder of the woman she was supposed to be, and the woman she was terrifyingly close to becoming. The near kiss, the confession, the raw moment of connection. It had changed everything. A new and unbearable tension now thrummed in the air between them. They were like two celestial bodies that had strayed too close, forever altering each other's orbits. Professionalism became a thin, brittle mask they both wore, a desperate attempt to ignore the gravity that pulled them together. The silences in his office were no longer tactical. They were heavy with unspoken words, charged with the memory of his touch. Lena was adrift. The clear, righteous anger that had fueled her for so long had been contaminated. Frank was no longer a symbol, a monster. He was a man, shaped by a grief that mirrored her own. Her mission, once a simple act of justice, now felt like a profound betrayal. How could she destroy him after he had shown her the cracked foundations of his soul? And worse, how could she not, without betraying the memory of her own father? She was trapped between two ghosts, and the conflict was tearing her apart. She began her own quiet investigation again, but this time, her target wasn't Frank. It was the past. She spent her nights in digital archives, pulling up old news articles, property records, and court filings. She needed to understand the war between the Costello and Antonelli families. She needed to know if Frank's story was the whole truth. She needed something, anything, to reignite the fire of her vengeance and burn away the confusion he had planted in her heart. What she found was murky, a tangled web of shell corporations and back-alley deals. But one name kept appearing in the periphery of her father's business collapse. Nico Costello. Not Frank. The old man. The patriarch. A cold seed of doubt began to sprout in the fertile ground of her confusion. One afternoon, Frank called her to his office. The moment she walked in, she knew something was wrong. The usual predatory calm was gone, replaced by a restless, caged energy. He was pacing in front of the window, his jaw tight, his shoulders rigid. "We have a problem," he said without preamble, his voice like flint. "A big one. The Antonellis are making a move, not on our businesses, on us." Lena felt a surge of cold adrenaline. What kind of move? "Nico is a man of routine," Frank said, stopping to stare out at the city. "Every Thursday he plays cards at the SEMA Club. Has for 40 years. Same time, same route, same driver. He thinks it makes him predictable, and therefore safe. I've told him for years it makes him a target." He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes was raw. "We have a source inside the Antonelli crew. They're planning to hit his car tonight, on the way home. It's not a warning, it's an execution." The room seemed to tilt. Nico, the old man who had looked into her soul, who had anointed her. The thought of him. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice a strained whisper. "I'm going to end it," Frank said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal growl. "I've been playing chess with these children. Tonight I'm flipping the board over. My source gave me the location where they're staging the hit. We're going to get there first. We're not going to stop them. We're going to erase them." The finality in his tone was absolute. This wasn't business. This was the fire Nico had warned her about, finally unleashed. "Why are you telling me this?" Lena asked, her heart pounding. "Because I need you," he said. And the simple admission was more shocking than the threat of violence. "My men are soldiers. They see the enemy in front of them. You. You see the board. You see the traps. I want you at the command post with me. I need your eyes." The command post was a darkened van parked on an industrial street, its windows offering a clear view of the shabby auto body shop where the Antonelli crew was gathering. The air inside the van was thick with tension, and the smell of ozone from the bank of electronic surveillance monitors. Lena sat in front of a screen that showed a grainy black and white feed from a hidden camera across the street. Frank stood behind her, a dark, silent statue, his presence a palpable force. Sal was at the wheel, his knuckles white as he gripped it. On the screen, Lena watched as several men armed with automatic weapons loaded into two cars. They were young, cocky, moving with the careless swagger of boys playing at war. They were laughing. "They think they're about to make history," Frank murmured from behind her, his voice a venomous whisper. "They're right. Just not the way they think." Lena felt a wave of nausea. These were the men she was supposed to see as her allies in taking Frank down. But watching them, she felt nothing but revulsion. They were cheap thugs, driven by ego and greed. They weren't fighting for a father's memory. They were just killers. Her eyes scanned the scene, her mind working, looking for the flaw in Frank's plan. His strategy was brutal and simple. Wait for them to leave, follow them, and then ambush the ambushers, catching them in a pincer movement on a deserted stretch of road. It was a perfect trap. But something was wrong. It was too easy. The Antonellis were reckless, but were they stupid? To stage a hit on Nico Costello from such an obvious, grimy location? It felt theatrical. Show, don't tell. "Frank," she said, her voice tight, "this is a performance." "What are you talking about?" he snapped, his patience worn thin. "Look at them," she urged, pointing at the screen. "They're not acting like a professional hit squad. They're acting like gangsters from a movie. They're drawing attention to themselves. And this location, it's exposed. Why not a private garage? Why a place with so many windows?" She turned in her chair to look up at him, her eyes wide with a sudden, horrifying realization. This isn't the hit squad. This is a diversion. They want you to see them. They want you to follow them. Frank stared at the screen, his face a mask of stone. To lead us into a trap. "No," Lena said, her mind racing, connecting the dots. "To lead you into a trap. To pull you and your best men away from what they're really after." "Nico's route is covered." Frank started to argue, but she cut him off. "It's not Nico," she said, the horrible certainty landing in her gut. "He's the bait, but he's not the target. They know how you think. They know you'd do anything to protect him. They know you'd bring your strongest forces to cut them off. Who does that leave unprotected?" Frank's eyes widened, a flicker of cold, primal fear breaking through his composure. The one person he never considered a target. The one person he assumed was untouchable. Removed from the game. "You," he breathed. Suddenly, everything made sense. The performance at the auto shop, the obvious bait. The entire operation wasn't about killing an old man. It was about creating a crisis that would draw the king out from his castle, leaving the throne empty. And what was the throne? The source of all his power, his office, his kingdom in the sky. "Sal," Frank barked, his voice cracking like a whip. "The building. Get us back to the building now." The van roared to life, tires screaming as Sal threw it into a wild U-turn. Lena was thrown back in her seat, her mind reeling. She stared at the monitor as the auto body shop grew smaller. The men there were a feint, a ghost army. The real war was happening somewhere else. And as they sped through the city, back towards the gleaming glass tower that represented everything Frank had built, a single devastating thought pierced through Lena's panic. Her research. Her late-night digging into the Costello family's past. She had been accessing their secure servers from her own laptop. She had been careful, using encryption, but a determined hacker. She had been looking for a crack in Frank's fortress. What if, in her search, she had accidentally left the door wide open? What if the flaw they were about to find was her? The lobby of Costello Industries was a scene of controlled chaos. The night security guards were on the floor, their hands bound with zip ties, a clear sign of a professional, silent assault. The private elevator bank stood open and dark. The power had been cut. "They're not here to steal money," Frank said, his voice dangerously calm as he surveyed the scene. The rage was gone, replaced by an icy, lethal focus. "They're here to steal data. Our operations, our accounts, our contacts, everything." He looked at Lena, and in his eyes she saw the horrifying confirmation of her fears. He knew. They're after the servers. "The servers are in a secure vault on the penthouse level," Sal stated, pulling a compact, heavy-looking pistol from an ankle holster. "It would take a week to breach it." "Not if you have the codes," Frank countered, his gaze still locked on Lena. "Not if someone gave them a key." The accusation was unspoken, but it hung between them, heavy and suffocating. My God, she thought, her blood turning to ice. Had she done this? Had her quest for information been the ultimate act of betrayal? The stairs, Frank commanded, turning away from her. Let's go. The climb up 60 flights of stairs was a grueling, heart-pounding ascent through a silent, dead building. Lena's lungs burned, her legs ached, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the maelstrom in her mind. She had come here to be the agent of his destruction, and now she was racing to prevent a different version of it, one she may have unwittingly caused. The irony was a bitter acid in her throat. Was this justice? Was this vengeance? It felt like a sick, twisted joke. They emerged onto the penthouse floor, into the hushed, carpeted reception area. The chaotic painting on the wall seemed to mock the silent tension. Frank moved with a predator's grace, Sal a half-step behind him, a loyal shadow. Lena followed, her body trembling, feeling utterly useless, a liability. The heavy wooden doors to Frank's office were ajar. From inside, they could hear the faint, rhythmic clicking of a keyboard. With a silent hand signal, Frank and Sal took positions on either side of the doorway. Frank glanced at Lena, a final, unreadable look, and then he kicked the door open. They burst into the room. The scene was anticlimactic. No army of thugs. Just one man, sitting at Frank's desk, his back to them, typing calmly on Frank's laptop. He didn't even flinch at their violent entrance. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out, Frankie," the man said, his voice smooth and familiar. He slowly swiveled the leather chair around to face them. It was Julien Dubois, the charming, silver-haired art dealer from Geneva. He smiled, a lazy, confident expression on his handsome face. He wasn't armed. He didn't need to be. "Julien," Frank breathed, his voice a mixture of disbelief and pure hatred. "You work for the Antonellis?" "Work for them?" Julien laughed, a soft, condescending sound. "My boy, my mother was an Antonelli. I am the Antonellis. The young, foolish boys were my cousins. Cannon fodder to keep you occupied." He gestured around the magnificent office. "All this empire you built on the ghost of your father. It's impressive. But you made the same mistake he did. You trusted the wrong person." His eyes slid from Frank and settled on Lena. "Didn't he, my dear?" Lena felt the floor drop out from under her. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Your late-night activities have been most helpful," Julien said, his charming smile turning cruel. "Your digital footprints led my people right to the server's back door. It took some work, but a flaw is a flaw. You were looking for a way to destroy him. Well, congratulations. You succeeded. I'm downloading the last of his files now. Everything. He'll be ruined." So it was true. She had done it. She had been his downfall, just not in the way she had ever intended. She looked at Frank. His face was a mask of granite, but she could see the flicker of profound betrayal in his eyes. It was a wound deeper than any bullet could inflict. "She didn't know," Frank said, his voice a low growl. "This is on me. I brought her in." "Oh, how noble," Julien sneered. "Protecting your prize. It's a shame. You two, you have a certain broken poetry together." He looked down at the laptop screen. "Almost done. And then, the end of the line for the Costellos." In that moment, something inside Lena snapped. The confusion, the guilt, the warring loyalties, it all burned away, leaving behind a single clarifying point of rage. This man, this snake in a bespoke suit, had used her. He had used her grief, manipulated her mission, and twisted her quest for justice into a tool for his own petty war. He had mocked the memory of her father and Frank's. "You're wrong," she said, her voice clear and cold, startling everyone in the room. She took a step forward. "You talk about flaws," she said, her eyes locked on Julian's. "But you have one too, a big one." "Oh?" Julian looked amused. "And what is that?" "Vanity," she said. "You had to be here yourself, didn't you? You couldn't let one of your thugs do it. You had to sit in his chair, at his desk, to savor the moment. You're not a strategist. You're just a sad little boy who wants to prove he's better than the man who beat his family." Julian's smile faltered, a flicker of anger in his eyes. "Clever words." "It's more than words," Lena said. taking another slow step toward the desk. Frank watched her, his expression a mixture of confusion and dawning understanding. "You said you were downloading the last of the files, but you're not, because Frank doesn't keep his core data on a local server. That would be a flaw." She glanced at Frank, a silent communication passing between them. "His most critical files, the real heart of the Empire, are air-gapped. They're on a closed system, completely disconnected from any network. Aren't they, Frank?" A slow, dangerous smile spread across Frank's face. "The old ways are the safest." Julian's face went pale. He stared at the progress bar on the screen, then back at them, his mask of smug superiority finally cracking. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Lena said, now standing directly across the desk from him. "What you're downloading is a ghost. A decoy file, bloated to look like the real thing, designed to keep a hacker busy long enough for the system to trace them." She looked at the small jade dragon on the corner of the desk, Frank's talisman. "And inside that decoy file is a lovely little virus that, once the download is complete, will wipe every drive connected to your network. You haven't been stealing his kingdom, Julian. You've been poisoning your own." Julian stared at her, his face a mask of dawning horror. He lunged for the laptop to stop the download, but Sal was faster. The big man crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing Julian and hauling him out of the chair as if he were a child. It was over. In the silence that followed, Lena stood with her hands braced on Frank's desk, her body trembling. She looked up and met Frank's eyes. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a raw, staggering flood of emotion she couldn't name. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice rough. "You told me," she whispered. "You said the secret was to know your own flaws and protect them. I gambled that your biggest flaw, your paranoia, was also your greatest strength." He walked around the desk until he was standing in front of her. The space between them was electric, just as it had been in his apartment. But the ghosts were gone. All that was left was them. "You saved me, Lena," he said, the words heavy with the weight of everything they had been through. "No," she said, looking up at him, the truth of her journey finally clear. "We saved each other." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw, just as he had before. But this time, she did not flinch. This time, she leaned into his touch, a gesture of acceptance, of a future she never could have imagined. His thumb stroked her cheek, a tender, possessive gesture. He didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to hear it. In his eyes, she saw the promise of a new story, one not written by the ghosts of their fathers, but by them. She had come to conquer the billionaire Mafia boss, to expose his secrets and burn his empire to the ground. But somewhere in the ashes of her vengeance, she had found his heart. And in the most unexpected and dangerous of victories, he had conquered hers. He lowered his head, and this time nothing stood in their way.